I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm an environmental sociologist. And I am an environmentalist. I've been working on the intersection of environment and race and place for 4 decades. And if we look at environmental justice in the era of climate change and COVID, we can see that, first of all, communities of color are disproportionately, in the US, are disproportionately impacted by environmental pollution. And if we look at COVID 19, it's like a heat seeking missile that's targeting the most vulnerable population in terms of health, but also targeting the most environmentally sensitive population. African Americans and Latinos are 3 times as likely to become infected as their white neighbors, and nearly twice as likely to die from COVID 19. And if we look at that connection between pollution and COVID, a recent Harvard study showed that high levels of pollution, particularly particulate matter, will increase the likelihood of dying by 15% if you're in those high polluted areas. There's also a racial footprint when it comes to climate and COVID. When we talk about racial redlining, that is discrimination in the location of people being able to buy houses or not. Racial redlining practice against people of color a century ago in the 20s and 30s is showing up in terms of urban heat islands. Red line neighborhoods or neighborhoods that were discriminated against are 5 to 13 degrees hotter. Red line is also showing up in terms of COVID 19 dangers and segregated neighborhoods of color. Long before Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, people of color knew and learned the hard way that waiting for the government can be hazardous to your health. The government has always been slow to respond to disasters when it involves poor people, working class people, and people of color. Climate change will exacerbate these inequalities and vulnerabilities of already marginalized populations. If we look at the, the impact of climate change, we'll have more bad air days. And the fact that more bad air days means more unhealthy people and death. And if you look at in the US, people of color and poor people are more likely to live in um, cities and metropolitan areas that are in violation of the Clean Air Act. And if you look at this whole notion of um, health equity and racial justice, an EPA study, 2018 EPA study showed that in 46 states, people of color live with more air pollution than whites. America is segregated along racial lines, even in 2020, and so is pollution. People of color breathe 38% more polluted air than whites. And if we talk about this whole question of breathe at your own risk, uh, we're saying that, uh, for example, air pollution causes over 200,000 early deaths each year, and a disproportionate share of those premature deaths are poor people and people of color. African Americans are almost 3 times more likely than whites to die from asthma. And if you look at black children, for example, black children are 10 times more likely to die from asthma than white children. And when we talk about climate and vulnerability, who gets left behind? You know, the Hurricane Katrina was a textbook case of environmental racism and climate racism when we talk about injustice. If we talk about climate change will hit the poor and people of color in the southern United States hardest. If we do nothing in terms of climate policy in the US, the country will lose a 6% drop in its GDP. But the southern part of the US will lose a 20% drop. The South is already the poorest part of the country and the country that's least likely to move forward with progressive energy, climate, and civil rights provisions. Climate change will widen the economic gap. Disasters, resources, recovery dollars, generally the path of that it follows is money follows money, money follows power, and money follows whites. After major severe weather events that were tracked over the last couple of decades, looking at $10 billion damages, white communities, after recovery dollars were spent, on average, were $126,000 better off in wealth after the recovery dollars went in. However, communities of color, on average, lost about $29,000. Now, this is significant in that Black people and Latinos only wealth is only 10% of that of white wealth. Climate action plans must address equity, racial justice, and economic justice. Addressing equity is a prerequisite for achieving climate resilience. Now, with FEMA's COVID 19 response, new guidance saying that communities, if there's a disaster, your first line is to shelter in place, stay put. Now, for those communities that got 15 inches of water in their houses, and they're in a one level, uh, not 15 inches, you get 6 feet, 7 feet of water, then you're going to drown if you only got one level. And so many communities right now are having to deal with COVID, sheltering in place because of disaster shelters. It's the last resort because of COVID. You can't shelter in place. So those communities on the front line for flooding, hurricanes, and we're dealing with communities like that right now in Lake Charles and Mossville, in Port Arthur, Texas, in Mobile right now with Sally, in Pensacola with Wedgwood. These are communities that we've worked with for the last 25, 30 years. COVID-19 has made it much more stringent, and the FEMA policies has inadvertently created additional layer of waiting to get rescued or drowning or being flooded out. Those are realities.